like this is quasi-judicial. Or as Jim would say, quasi-judicial.
Yes. Quasi.
I don't know why he says quasi. He's the only one I know who says quasi.
It ends with I. Quasi.
Quasi. I can say quasi-judicial if you want, Paula. I can make that city policy.
That's okay. I'll just take it that you're that much younger.
According to the dictionary, it's quasi.
Is it quasi?
Quasi.
Yeah. Well, see, that's what I said.
Quasi-judicial. Quasi-judicial.
Age.
Done. It's easier to
We've
say.
all had disadvantages.
It's easier to say. To be fair, I still say story wrong because my parents didn't say it enough.
Oh my gosh.
And that's why they're not together anymore.
You're here for the hearing? Are you here for the hearing?
Yes.
Okay. We were, here he is. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's okay.
We waited for you.
We
I wanted to make sure that we had a
You can
quorum
actually blame that on me.
in the case that we didn't have a quorum.
It's actually my fault.
Yeah.
Double quorum.
We just wanted to make sure we were going to be able to have this meeting tonight and not have to postpone it.
Alright. Are you
Are
ready?
you ready?
Well, the microphone seems to be turned on.
Okay. Record.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'm calling the meeting to order at 6:04 p.m. Roll call, Omega.
Necas,
Here.
Amundson,
Here.
Godown,
Here.
Gordon. Excused. She sent an email earlier that she was not going to be present tonight. Jennings,
Here.
thank you.
Okay, would you join me in the pledge of allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do we have any additions or deletions to the agenda? Okay, public comment period. The public comment portion of the agenda is the opportunity for the planning commission to listen to the public, but not for dialogue. The commentators are allowed up to 3 minutes to present information relevant to this quorum, not otherwise listed as an agenda item. Please note, complaints should first be addressed to the appropriate city department and/or the city manager prior to directly addressing the planning commission. Any public comments? Okay, next on the agenda, we have a vote for the approval of the minutes. Omega had caught, and Liam caught a couple errors in the minutes. We made the correction, where it says, under C, public hearing, it opens at 6:03 p.m. on SUB-24-001. That was changed to LA-24-002. And then Liam noted that it was not quasi ex parte. And those changes were made. So do we have approval of the minutes with the changes?
I make the motion, we approve the minutes with the changes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next on the agenda, public hearing, planning file number SUB-24-002. Good evening, my name is Paula Necas. I am the chair of the Sheridan Planning Commission, and I will be presiding over this public hearing. This is the time and place set forth for the public hearing in the matter of file number SUB-24-002, an application for preliminary subdivision approval and floodplain development approval for a 27-lot subdivision on approximately 7.5 acres of residentially zoned land, currently referred to as the Bridge Street subdivision. The hearing is now open. It is 6:08 p.m. Law requires several items to be read into the record at the beginning of each public hearing. The applicable criteria upon which this case will be decided are found in the Sheridan Development Code, section 16.570, subdivision application. The specific criteria are summarized in the staff report and will be reviewed during this hearing. All testimony and evidence received during the public hearing must be directed toward the criteria or to such law, rule, regulation, or policy which you believe to apply to this case. The case will proceed with the staff report followed by the applicant and all those who are in support of the application. All those who are opposed to the application will then be allowed to speak, followed by those with general comments who are neither for nor against this application. The commission or staff may then question the applicant and those who testify. The applicant will be given an opportunity to rebut any testimony or evidence. If you have any documents, maps, or letters that you wish to have considered by this body, they must be formally placed in the record of this proceeding. To do that, either before or after you speak, please leave the material with Deputy City Recorder Omega Rodella Garces, who will make sure that your evidence is identified and placed in the record. Prior to the conclusion of the first hearing on a land use application, any participant may request an opportunity to present additional evidence or testimony regarding the application. If such a request is made, it will be up to this body to determine if the hearing will be continued to a time and date certain, or if the record will be kept open for submission of additional evidence or testimony. If the record is kept open, it will be for a minimum of 7 days, with a short rebuttal period thereafter afforded to the applicant. An issue which may be the basis for an appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals, LUBA, shall be raised not later than the final public hearing on this case. Such issues shall be raised with and accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford this body and the parties to this hearing an adequate opportunity to respond to each issue. The public hearing will proceed first with the staff report. After a summary of the application and applicable criteria is presented, interested parties are given an opportunity to testify. Any party testifying before the commission must give their name and address for the record. Before we begin with the staff report, I must ask a few questions. For the audience, are there any objections to the jurisdiction of the Planning Commission to hear this matter? For the Planning Commission, are there any declarations of conflict of interest, ex parte contacts, or bias by any planning commissioner? None. For the audience, are there any challenges as to conflicts of interest, ex parte contacts, or bias related to any member of the commission, council? City Planner Liam F. Bean, please give the staff report. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Paula, for reading the statement. And like I said, that's the last one for subdivisions for a bit, so you're gonna be able to save your voice for variances. Hey everybody, so I want to just start this staff report off the same way I started actually the last subdivision staff report off. This is an amendment to a previous approved subdivision. So the Sheridan Municipal Code, one of the faults that we've identified, right, is that there's no major amendments process for subdivision applications or partition applications. The previous application, which is locally referred to as sub 2201, is for 32 lots and is on the same subject property. It is still currently active and approved. this application is to take that lot subdivision and go from 32 lots to 27 lots. So it's reducing the number of lots and increasing the lot size. One thing to point out, one of the reasons why that's not in substantial conformance with the previous decision. The previous decision was looking at a very different street configuration. So the previous street configuration had the creation of 3 new streets. This is just the creation of 2, with one being what we would classify as a loop. So that's really what requires additional review to the Planning Commission, right? The Planning Commission made the initial decision. We have no procedure for amending it, and therefore we need a fresh decision for a major amendment. So there's going to be some things that I don't focus on too much in this hearing. For example, there are wetlands on this property, but the applicant has already functionally done a wetland delineation and is applying for joint permitting through DSL and the, I forget if this is a jurisdictional wetland or not, but they've applied for their DSL, DEQ, Army Corps joint permit, the JPA, right, the big one. And there's already been some permitting. And if the applicant were, let's say tomorrow, even before this decision is finalized, move dirt on site, they would have absolute permission to do so, as long as they had approved civil construction plans, because they have an approved subdivision for 32 lots. So before we go into it, just that's the context, is this is an amendment, right? It's not, it is, we have to process it fresh, but it is an amendment to an approval. So just the general findings of fact, the applicant and property owner are the same. It's Andrew Burton of Creekside Homes. Included the description of the subject property and its zoning designation of R2. It's about a 7.5 acre property that is vacant. Unfortunately, a lot of that vacant land is wetlands. So it does make development on this property difficult, and that's why you'll notice that a large tract of the proposed subdivision, proposed tract A, is just a reserve tract. That's a reserve tract for wetlands and storm drainage. So there's a few places in the findings where it gets called out and treated differently because it's real big, but generally that is appropriate. And it's unfortunate that it's on the lot, but the applicant is doing their best given the site considerations. So like I said, there is a prior land use decision that directly relates to this one. That's subdivision 2022-01. Again, that was made on behalf of the property owner by Mirio Designs, and a lot of the material is the same. I described the land use of the abutting properties, but generally there are no land uses that abut this property that are in significant conflict. It's almost entirely zoned residential. So a little ways up, we've got some public works facilities, but they're nowhere close. This is a residential subdivision surrounded by residential land that is mostly developed as residential or vacant. And a small portion of the property does abut the 100-year floodplain. You'll actually notice it's sort of the edge of our floodplain mapping. However, the area where development is occurring is not currently in the mapped 100-year floodplain. Again, that's all going to be pretty much where tract A is. If you take a look at that, that big reserve tract on the bottom is going to eat most of the floodplain. We reached out for comment from multiple agencies. We received comment just from the fire district and from Sheridan Public Works, and those comments have been incorporated into these findings of fact. Prior to this hearing, we have received no public comment on this amendment. So we'll go through the applicable criteria, and I'm going to try and play just the hits, if that's okay. Hit number 1 is permitted use, section 16.215.020. There's a lot of permitted uses in this underlying zone. The applicant hasn't stated exactly which land use will go for which lot, that they don't need to do that. It's not a planned unit development. So we have assumed that they need to meet the minimum for a single family dwelling, because that's the smallest lot size in the underlying zone. Because all the lots are going to meet that criteria as we go through later, we find that all of these lots are going to be buildable. Some are even larger than that and could already site a duplex, one lot. But generally, these are all going to be buildable lots, and as you all are aware, those lot sizes may change in our code as well. And so it's nice that there's no uses locked in here. So we find that each lot meets the minimum development standards for a detached single-family dwelling. Then we can evaluate the specific use of each lot at the time a building permit is applied for. I'm going to skip the density standard section because there is no density standard for single-family dwellings. It's a repeat of the minimum lot size standard. And I will get to section 16.215.060.a, which is the dimensional standards. The minimum lot area for a single-family dwelling is 5,000 square feet. That's the smallest lot you can have, the underlying zone that's not for a public or special use. And the smallest proposed lot would be lot 13, which is approximately 5,045 square feet. And we found that there's no other lots smaller than lot 13, and therefore all of the lots are in conformance with the minimum lot size. Lot width and depth, section 16.215.060.d. I'm going to save you all the math. I measured all the lots, including the odd sized ones, based off of the lot width and depth definitions in our code. There was not a single lot that was deeper than 2.5 times the lot width, so the criterion is met. There's generally, most of the lots in this subdivision kind of fall into certain dimensional categories, but because of the shape of the roads, there's a couple of odd ones. So if you want to pay attention to that, I would read the findings for lot 15 and lot 27, but generally these lots are all compliant. Redevelopment plan. So normally we require a redevelopment plan if there's going to be any reserve tracts greater than 1 acre or any lots greater than 1 acre created. Tract A is pretty large. It is just a little bit bigger than 1 acre. However, because Tract A, again, is that reserve tract for the floodplain and the wetlands and the stormwater detention, it's not going to be redeveloped, and therefore we do not require a redevelopment plan of the applicant as part of this application. All of the lots to be created will be buildable and are suitable for the uses in their underlying zone. So I did make a single finding about the floodplain, and that finding is that the buildable lots are outside of the floodplain. So we are not requiring floodplain development review as part of this application. But it is noted in this application that it is not being required. So that takes us to section 16.315, specifically 16.315.030.a, which is our minimum lot area standards, which we already covered. It repeats. So that's the third time that 5,000 square feet minimum lot size gets mentioned. We can then go to 16.315.030.b, which is the standards for lot and parcel access. So all lots and parcels to be created in the city of Sheridan must have at least 25 feet of frontage on a public way. You'll notice that the smallest possible frontage that these lots have is 54 feet, and therefore all lots exceed the minimum frontage, and this criteria is met. The lot sideline, which would be section 16.315.030.e, is the idea that they will run as best as possible at 90 degrees to the street to which they intersect. If you take a look at the plat map, you may notice that a few of the lots aren't running at quite exactly 90. That's because the street has a very slight bend. They're running at nearly 90. And you'll notice that the lot is oddly dimensioned. It's not an even square. The subject property is kind of trapezoidal. So that's what sort of results in that, is that they may not be perfectly 90 where they intersect the street because it gently bends. That's appropriate. It's within a reasonable deviation. It's as far as practicable. They're functionally still rectangles, right? So we find that the criteria of that section for lot sidelines is met. Section 16.315.03.f is lot grading. So the applicant provided grading information for their streets plan, but there's not detailed grading for the lots. We recognize that as a subdivider, they're not responsible for grading each independent lot prior to planning. Some of these lots are going to be on the beginning of a hillside, and they may need substantial grading at the time of construction, but we would evaluate that at the time of construction. All the street grading is appropriate. So all the street grading meets the criteria. The lot grading would be met at the time of construction. And that's standard. For 16.315.030.g is utility easements. So this is specifically talking about the public utilities easement. The applicant has shown a 10-foot private utilities easement along all lots. That's required. There is no area except for on track A where there appears like there might be public utilities crossing the private property. On track A, we can tell if it was a private side stormwater line or a public side line that crossed into the property to connect to the stormwater system. So we included a generic condition that says, hey, if at some time public utilities are installed across private property, you will make sure there's a 12-foot easement. But they're already making sure that there's the 10-foot private utilities easement that we require. Other than that, the engineer didn't see any areas where there could be a need for a public utilities easement. In terms of the general standards for lot and blocks, 16.315.040.A, this is a tricky one, right? All the blocks and lots are appropriate for the uses contemplated. Theoretically, the primary use contemplated is as single-family dwellings, and the configuration and lot sizes and dimensions are all appropriate so that a single-family dwelling could be built on those lots with appropriate grading. So there's no conflict with use. Certainly these lots aren't appropriate to build a new mill, but that's not their goal, right? 16.315.040.B is the block sizes. So we're running into this quite a bit with the wetland developments, right? Our minimum block length is 350 feet in length. Our code does say, except where topography and environmental conditions justify longer distances as determined by the decision authority. That would be the planning commission. So the recommended minimum distance between collector streets and arterial streets is 1,000 feet. You don't need to worry about here. Even though this is on Bridge Street, at that point, Bridge Street is designated as a local street. So everything being involved is either an existing local street or a new local street. So there is a north-south block along B Ave and a east that has that is about 100 feet. That little like north-south section. But the two long sections are east-west blocks. And both of those east-west blocks are longer than the 350-foot minimum, and they're both around 500 feet. One's 480, one's 430. So they're both smaller than 500 feet in length. And that's a center line to center line measurement. So that's the least, okay, if we're thinking about how long possibly could you walk, that's not the minimum block length, right? They're both longer than 350, but not significantly longer than 350. And the subject property includes delineated wetlands and 100-year floodplain. So the minimization of additional impervious area which would be created by, if there was an extra street splitting it in half, is significant, right? That does help reduce the stormwater runoff that would be created as part of the development. And because this is sort of a looped block and it's not incredibly long, adding about 100 feet to the block length doesn't destroy the pedestrian connectivity. It doesn't make it really hard to walk places. It's still pretty much highly connective if you're a pedestrian. Normally, staff might recommend on long blocks that we do some kind of long block mitigation, but we've got one block that's 430 feet in length, which is not that significant over a minimum, and another that's 480. Both of those are a little too short for a mid-block crossing to really be impactful. So staff didn't suggest we require any mitigation of the block length. The applicant's mitigating how much impervious area they're creating. They're making the best use of an oddly dimensioned lot that loses a lot of space to wetland, and we want to support that in this case. So that's our recommendation. And of course, there's no collector or arterial streets, so there's no issues. 16.315.040.C is the traffic circulation for blocks. The preliminary plan shows two local streets being created, A Avenue and B Avenue, and they're going to be in a looped configuration, which is generally a really good configuration for fire access, for traffic safety, for pedestrian access. In addition, our code defines nearby. It says how, if you're nearby, if you're nearby by bicycle distance to a certain facility or nearby to pedestrian distance to a certain facility, you need to maintain connectivity. Nearby for a pedestrian is a quarter mile. There are none of those facilities within a quarter mile of this development that we would have to worry about that pedestrian connectivity being maintained. Nearby for a bicyclist is a half mile. And right now in Sheridan, a local street is kind of part of that is our bicycle system. And this does create the expansions of local streets that connects on a local street that then turns into one of our collector streets that goes right to our downtown. And you'll notice that if you do that 1/2 mile radius of those services that a bicyclist could access, they've got a pretty clear path from this subdivision to them, especially if you consider the use of the other east-west streets to access the city park. So the traffic circulation is met. The next standard for block is 16.315.040.d, connectivity. So connectivity is basically our plan for ensuring future growth. That's what it is, right? That not just that our public access ways provide direct connections, but that dead end streets are at places where there's the potential for future development. There's primarily a looped street pattern, if you look at it, with proposed Avenue A and Avenue B. And Avenue A then ends up dead ending into another property. Now that property is an undeveloped residential property, and therefore having a street that dead ends there creates connectivity to that property and allows future development. So if you look at the previous plan, there was a similar dead end street that ended on the same property. The location was a little different, but they're basically the same. So staff find that the criteria are met and that the dead end street serves the ability of us to increase the development potential of other properties. Section 16.315.040.e is the collector and arterial connections. Well, we don't have any collector or arterial connections until you go down Bridge Street. So Bridge Street is a local street. The existing right-of-way is wider than it needs to be. It's a 60-foot right-of-way. Our current requirement is a 50-foot right-of-way. But it's existing, it's platted, it's out there, it's just not developed. And it does turn into a collector later. So the connection to a collector's bridge just goes from local to collector as it goes down. And that's served in the subdivision. Criteria for section 16.315.040.b, sorry, 050.b. Improvement requirements. So I won't go down all the improvement requirements. I make the findings in the same order as the code. The applicant generally accepts that there will need to be some kind of frontage and improvements, and they have submitted a composite utility plan. There's only a few of these that I really want to highlight. Generally, you're going to see the recommended conditions and comments are the same. We've got a composite utility plan, and we've got some preliminary plans for streets, but we're not at final civil drawings yet. So a lot of this is going to be that third verse, same as the first. We're waiting. If we'll approve civil drawings when they come prior to construction. Civil drawings will be submitted and accepted to our engineer, right? But let's talk about the frontage. So it's a little funky because North Bridge Street is a local street, even though it's a collector just to the south, and it's our major collector, but not here. It's local, classified under a TSP. And that change happens pretty significantly down, but it's still a 60 feet subdivision. So the applicant has, in some places, stated that they plan on doing a half street improvement for Bridge Street. In other places, they've stated a 3/4 street improvement. Sometimes the drawing shows something closer to a half. Sometimes the drawing shows something more similar to 3/4. Generally, sometimes when people are talking about half street improvements and 3/4 street improvements, they usually mean the same thing, right? They mean a partial street improvement. We are going to require the 3/4 partial street improvement, just a little bit wider, to about a 27-foot travel lane, and that's shown on these plans. I don't think that it's anything like any confusion. I just think it's people use the same word to mean different things. Somebody might call it a half street improvement. Somebody else calls it a 3/4 street improvement. We're going to require the 3/4, and it is shown on the plans. So as part of that, we're going to require the frontage along Bridge Street be improved prior to planning, all the way with curb gutter sidewalks, right? That it connects down to the collector. It needs the 3/4 street improvement. And so what that means is that when their neighbor gets annexed and then goes to develop, they would finish that quarter street improvement with curb gutter sidewalk and then finish the street all the way out. So it should be able to handle the volume created by one subdivision, and then as another occurs, it'll be able to handle that volume as well. Other than that, we're just going to be recommending standard frontage improvements, and with the conditions of approval, it's the standard practice that curb, gutter, and street be done before you plat for all of the newly created local streets, and that your sidewalk and landscaping plantings be done before you go to pull your certificate of occupancy for the house. So you're gonna see that is in the conditions of approval, and it's gonna be in the other streets and frontage sections. So project streets, the only real comment on the project streets is that, just like in the last subdivision, we're gonna request barricades at the dead-end streets. We're gonna want the barricades shown in the civil plans, and we'll want a type of barricade that is approved and accepted by Sheridan Public Works at the time. We don't expect to need a gate in this place. A traditional barricade is probably appropriate. And then a standard comment, 1200 C permits. Monuments, monuments will be done per Oregon state law. Surface drainage, so there is going to be a water quality and water detention facility on site. We haven't gotten detailed plans about that yet. So the conditions of approval are just going to be the civil planning, right? Detailed civil plans to be submitted to Public Works for acceptance and review prior to construction. Right? We're reviewing the planning documents. We will get the detailed civil plans and make sure they comply. Sanitary sewer, much the same. Sanitary sewer looks pretty appropriate in the composite utility plans, but we will be requesting civil construction plans prior to construction. Water system, we received a comment from the fire department. They wanted to ensure that the fire hydrant standard is met. And then again, the water line plans are provided in the composite utility plan we will be requesting. We recommend requesting as a condition of approval the civil plans. Sidewalks, tentative plan shows curb, gutter, and sidewalk improvements along the frontage of all newly created lots, and it also shows the curb and gutter just along the frontage of Bridge Street that fronts that property, as is appropriate for the 3/4 street improvement. Same condition as the frontage improvements. The improvements to Bridge Street should be done before platting. Curb and gutter should be done before platting for all the other new streets, and then sidewalk needs to be done prior to pulling a certificate of occupancy for that dwelling unit. Yes, planter strips is other should be landscaping. The applicant has indicated that they plan to provide landscaping. We don't have the preliminary landscaping plan yet. That can be worked out with our engineer. As we've discussed with our local streets, we've got some weirdness about how to make the planting work. So it's kind of nice when this is the civil process because of our differing width standards. Street lighting locations were not included, but the applicant has indicated in several places that they plan to do the street light improvements. That would be part of the civil plans. Street signs and striping, same thing. Crosswalks and street signs are included in street civil plans there. So there's not detailed street striping. The second part of this section is the public improvements bond. We will be requesting that prior to construction there be a 125% public improvements bond and then a 25% maintenance bond. And the point of those bonds is if the applicant begins the work, it gives the city the ability to help finish in the case that something happens. So we like to have that as it's literally our insurance policy when we dig up streets. Public facilities, third verse, same as the first. We kind of just did the big overview of public facilities. Some of these are going to pop out and be important. That first criteria, comply with public works standards, not the most important one. Same thing with that second criteria, application of public facility standards. Both of those are sort of boilerplate, and the applicant has indicated on their narrative that they plan to comply with our public facility standards. Utility lines and facilities, same thing with the first standards comment here. They plan to comply with our public utility standards. Same thing with the findings for .020B and .020C, right? These are all, like I said, standard comments during civil planning. This will be hashed out by the engineers. I'm actually just going to skip to the next. These are all the same things I just talked about. It's going to say water, storm, street lights. We actually need to get to storm, which is going to be on page 27 of your packet. And that's going to be bullet 6, section 16.360.020, easements. Private utility easements are shown on the preliminary plat that are approximately 10 feet wide. There appears to be no plan for public utility easements, but there also appears to be no need for public utility easements. In the case that there is a need for public utility easements, the applicant will show it on their plat. That's a condition of approval. Recommended condition of approval. Storm drainage section is section 16.370, so section 16.370.030, storm drainage and erosion control plan required. We do require a storm drainage and erosion plan The DEQ 1200C permit can serve as part of that erosion control plan. You don't have to create it from scratch. A stormwater report was not included with this specific application, so we would just require it as a condition of approval prior to construction. Pretty much the same thing with civil plans. And it's not necessarily needed to get out of the planning stage. We have to have it for construction, but not necessary for planning. That's the same with the next section. The street standards, this is more me again. This is where the rubber hits the road. I made that joke last time. I only got one. Section 16.380.030.a, general provisions. The location, width, and grades of streets shall be considered in their relation to existing and planned streets, to topographical conditions, and to public convenience and safety. The width of all newly dedicated right-of-way is to be 50 feet. The width of the existing right-of-way for Bridge Street is 60 feet, which is over compliant. So the plans show all new and existing streets being compliant, and it plans for the logical continuation of an existing important street in Sheridan. So there's no negative impact to public convenience and or safety, and staff find the criteria of that section are met. I'm going to skip a couple of the street ones, unless you want to talk about the alignment of T intersections. There are none. So I'm going to switch to page 32 of the report. Almost all of the other street findings are appropriate. The street grades are all appropriate from the grading plan. And so are the curves and curve return radii and all that groovy stuff that I get to look at under a microscope. But section 16.380.030.I is the street naming provision. It says that street names shall conform to established pattern in the city and shall be subject to the approval of the decision authority. The tentative plat shows the creation of two new streets. These are listed as A Avenue and B Avenue. A Avenue primarily runs east to west. There is no proposed name for A Avenue, but the linear streets following cardinal directions in the city of Sheridan typically receive the suffix street. B Avenue is L-shaped with a long portion of the street running east to west before curving and running north to south to intersect A Avenue. Streets with this bending or looping pattern are typically referred to as loops in Sheridan, like box loop. So we recommend that the applicant give a name to A Avenue that ends in the suffix street, and that B Avenue be given a name ending in the suffix loop. Although street or way may be considered appropriate. Staff find that upon the inclusion of a condition of approval, that an address plan showing the name of each newly created street and the proposed addresses of each newly created lot be provided to the city recorder for review prior to the final plat recordation, that the criteria of this section are met. So if you all are comfortable with those street suffixes, I will include that as a recommendation. Grades and curves, I already told you. Grades are good. Curves are good. Curve return radii, also good. General right-of-way and improvement widths, we kind of, 16.380.040, we kind of touched on this before. There's points of the applicant's plan where it gets called a half-street improvement, and points where it gets called a three-quarter street improvement. We would be requiring the three-quarter street improvement for North Bridge Street, which would be about a 27-foot travel surface as determined by the applicant's engineer and our engineer during final civil planning. It just provides a little bit more in case that there is two-way traffic on that section, as opposed to a half-street improvement. And the Sheridan Fire Department noted that the proposed street widths are all wide enough for their engines to pass oncoming vehicles, even if there are vehicles parked in the right-of-way. So the Sheridan Fire Department has no issue with right-of-way widths and or the street layout, which was good news. The one condition that the fire department did mention that actually was in the use section is that they would like, because it intersects with the hillside, they would like to make sure that best management practices are taken for landscaping to make it fire resilient at the time of building permit. So they want to make sure that, you know, brush is cleared and that there's not plantings too near to structures, etc. And they've given a guide, an adopted guide, and I forget if it's a national level or an Oregon level guide to recommend to the applicant at the time of construction. Again, more boilerplate conditions. So, based on the facts above, staff concludes that upon the inclusion of several conditions of approval, that the application meets each element of every criterion necessary for approval, as set forth in Sheridan Development Code 16.70 subdivision application. Staff recommend that based on the findings and the conclusion made above, that the Planning Commission grant preliminary approval of the subdivision, and note that floodplain development approval is not required for this subdivision. The recommended conditions of approval are as follows. Conditions 1 is a public improvements performance bond valued at 125%. Be recorded with the city. The second is a maintenance bond valued at 25%. So the maintenance bond helps maintain the streets. The public improvements bond helps build in case they fall through. Condition 3 is sort of our master condition about civil plans. I'll read it in its entirety. This is important. All public and private facility improvements shall be designed and constructed in accordance with the Sheridan Public Works Design Standards, which have been adopted at the date of the issuance of this decision, and in accordance with all other city requirements and conditions. Prior to construction of each public improvement, final construction plans, which account for the comments provided in these findings, must be stamped by a professional engineer licensed in the state of Oregon and submitted to the city engineer for review, for conformance with the City of Sheridan Public Works Design Standards and acceptance. This review may include coordinating review by outside state agencies or the fire district. It is the responsibility of the applicant to resolve any design conflicts with the city prior to the installation of any of these public or private improvements. Final construction plans include, but are not limited to, the street sign and striping plan, a street lighting plan, other general street construction plans, the erosion and sediment control plan. Remember, that can be your DEQ 1200C if you need it to be. Sorry, that's what I cut in. A storm system and drainage plan, a grading plan, a sanitary sewer plan, a water systems plan, and a landscaping plan and planting schedule. And a lot of this, again, those also don't need to be independent planning documents. Many times they are composite documents, right? The street sign and striping plan may also be the street grading plan, right, for a street. So there's a lot of documents there, but that's all typical civil plans. Construction of all public improvements included in the applicant's preliminary plat must be completed prior to the recording of the final plat. This includes all public water system improvements, all public and private storm sewer and stormwater improvements, all public sanitary improvements, and select street and right-of-way improvements. Prior to the recording of the final, this is the next condition. Condition 4 is that the lots will still have that 10-foot private utility easement, and when necessary, there'll be a 12-foot public utility easement on the property. 5 is the improved curb and gutter on the frontage of each lot. That has to be done prior to platting. Prior to platting, the sidewalk improvement on North Bridge Street has to be completed. And prior to getting a certificate of occupancy for each structure, the sidewalk, curb, and gutter in front of that structure has to be completed. I always include this. The construction of this sidewalk may not be deferred. So that way, if they build out from the center of the subdivision first, it's not like, oh, you're creating island sidewalk. No, we'll allow you to defer construction of the sidewalk until you plat. But we will not allow the construction of this sidewalk to be deferred once it's time for construction. So prior to on-site construction, the applicant shall acquire a 1200C permit from DEQ and present that permit and its associated erosion control sheets to Sheridan Public Works, erosion control plan. Prior to recordation of the final plat, they'll install a barricade at the dead end, and the barricade is to be a type approved by Public Works. It's also part of the civil planning. Recommended condition 8 is prior to on-site construction, the applicant shall submit their stormwater report. That's going to include all the things Chris needs to evaluate it under Oregon stormwater law. Recommended condition 9 is the subdivision must be served by fire hydrants placed no more than 500 feet apart from one another. The applicant must install fire hydrants which are to be inspected and approved by the Sheridan Fire District prior to recording of the final plat. That's what the fire district recommended. The applicant would have had to do that anyway as part of their water planning, but the fire district is trying to get more involved in the review process. All public street trees must be planted with an appropriate root barrier or root guard, which shall be approved by Sheridan Public Works. You don't want your roots to tear up your sidewalk. Sometimes those don't even work. We do our darndest to keep the sidewalk good, y'all. 11, street landscaping along the frontage of North Bridge Street is required to be completed prior to the recording of the final plat. Street landscaping fronting each other lot in the subdivision shall be completed prior to issuing a certificate of occupancy for the first building. Don't want to make somebody do street landscaping and then they have people trampling it for months as they build houses there. That's a great way to establish landscaping. So just like the sidewalk, they can, if they choose, defer that until after construction. And with that, I conclude the staff report.
Thank you, Liam.
Great job, Lynn.
Are there any questions of staff from the commission before we continue and accept additional testimony? Any questions? Okay. I will now accept the applicant's testimony regarding the proposed subdivision. Would the applicant or the representative like to address the commission? No? Okay. Are there any questions of the applicant or of staff from the commission before we continue and accept additional testimony? Okay. I will now accept public testimony regarding the proposed subdivision. If you intend to present oral testimony, please fill out a request to speak form provided by Omega. Please also clearly state your name and address when you are called to speak. This will help in preparing accurate written minutes for the hearing. If you have written testimony or other evidence to submit, please also give that to staff so it can be entered into the record. We will begin with those in support of the application, followed by those who are opposed to the application, and we'll conclude with testimony of those who have general comments who are neither for nor against this application. Do we have anybody here to make public testimony? Since we don't have any public testimony, we don't need the applicant to address any public testimony. If there are no further questions from the commission of either staff or the public testimony is now over. I will close the public hearing at 6:49 p.m. I will now entertain planning commission discussion on the application. Do we want to discuss it? Do we want to move to passage?
Ready to move.
Okay. If there is no further planning commission discussion, staff recommend that the planning commission pass a motion adopting the staff report and recommending the city council approve the proposed amendments. A motion can be made by the planning commission at this time, and suggested motions are on page 37, or there is a suggested motion right here on this page.
I'm sorry, I must have gotten my scripts mixed up for the LA. We don't need to recommend it to the city council.
Okay. So here, there's a suggested motion here.
I can do that.
Okay.
I move that the planning commission adopt the staff report and findings of fact without changes and direct staff to prepare a planning commission order granting preliminary subdivision approval to the Bridge Street subdivision, subject to the recommended conditions of approval in the staff report.
Any second? All in favor? Aye. Well, thanks everybody who participated in this. This was good meeting. So next, on our agenda will be the planning commission comments. Do we have anybody with any comments? How's it going, Kennedy?
Crisis averted, thanks. Well, crisis mostly averted. We'll deal with the water damage later.
Good to know. Anybody have any comments, public planning commission comments? No? Do I hear a move to adjourn?
I make the motion that we adjourn.
Second?
A second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, guys, we did it. Thank you. Thank you.
That was a useful.
Thanks, Liam. This was
I'm having flashbacks to our reconfiguring.
Recording stopped.